Hi everyone, today we're going to be going over our second set of literary terms. These are ones that will start coming up in class soon. The 10 that we're going to go over today are allusion, epigraph, oxymoron, epinalepsis, anaphora, polysyndeton and asyndeton, alliteration, onomatopoeia, metonymy and synecdoche, and hyperbole. And just to get a sense of why we are grouping some of these together, numbers 4 through 7 on this list are all just more specific forms of repetition. So we've talked about repetition before, we've talked about how it's not an accident, it's not necessarily an indictment on the author's writing style that they can't come up with anything else to say. It's always purposeful, so we're looking at a couple more specific ways that authors use repetition here today. So let's start off with our first term, which is allusion. An allusion is an indirect reference to someone or something that is known from history, literature, religion, or another branch of culture. So for example, in a book, if you refer to Adam or Eve, that would be a biblical allusion. So that comes up a lot, like we talked about in How to Read Literature Like a Professor. Or if you call someone a Romeo, you're probably referring to Romeo and Juliet. So these can either be allusions that are made in literature or that are just made in conversation. And the purpose or the effect of an allusion is to allow writers to convey big ideas through a few associated words. So just bringing up somebody's name in these cases lets you in on the whole story without them needing to necessarily go in depth into the whole thing. Our second term is an epigraph. This is a quotation or an aphorism, which means like a short piece of writing at the beginning of a literary work that suggests the theme. So for example, we'll talk about this more in class, the excerpt from the poem The Second Coming that shows up before things fall apart would be an epigraph. So anything, if you look in a copy of a book, a lot of times we skip over these, but they can have a really good effect. They can help draw a connection between that main work and another work. So it gives us a hint about the main idea or the theme right away before we've begun the book. Our third term is oxymoron. This one might be familiar to some of us. This is a figure of speech that combines opposite or contradictory terms in a brief phrase. So within a few words, you have opposites. So for example, pretty ugly, bittersweet. And this creates a dramatic or comedic effect depending on how it is used in the context of the situation. Next we have epinalepsis. This is where you repeat the same word or phrase at both the beginning and at the end of the line, clause, or sentence. So like we talked about, our next few terms are specific branches of the term repetition, that literary device. This one is where you start and end with the same word or phrase in the line, clause, or sentence. So for example, this quote from Voltaire that says, "Common sense is not so common." This would be an example of epinalepsis because we have the word common repeated at the beginning and at the end of the same sentence. This can have a few possible effects. The primary one is that it creates symmetry within what you're saying. It also helps emphasize a point. So when we repeat something, it sticks in our head and it kind of emphasizes what the author wants us to take away from what they're saying. So having that here is another good example. Next we have anaphora, which is where, again, you repeat the same word, phrase, or clause, but it's at the beginning of two or more sentences in a row. So a famous example is from A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, where it says it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, so on and so forth. When it has it was the, that is anaphora because it is repeating that word or phrase at the beginning of multiple sentences here. Again, with other sources of repetition, anaphora can also help make the writer's point more coherent. So we have a good structure here. It's very logical. It also just adds a certain rhythm or flow to the writing. The next two we're going to talk about together, we have polysyndeton and asyndeton. Polysyndeton means that you use several coordinating conjunctions even when they aren't grammatically necessary. So as a reminder, a coordinating conjunction, those are the three and, but, or. So an example of polysyndeton would be saying over the weekend she needed to clean her room and clean the car and do her homework and go to work. You don't have to have the word and there in each spot. You could just replace that with commas or even split it into separate sentences. But because we have each of those listed here, that would be an example of polysyndeton. So this helps incorporate a rhythm into the writing, but it can also emphasize the length of a list. When you have something like this, adding the and on each one really draws it out and makes it seem like more dramatic and more work to do than if we had just had the commas through it. And a good way to remember the difference between these two, when you see the root poly at the beginning of this, that means many, right? We've talked about this before, polygamy, polyglot. Whenever we see poly, we should keep that in mind. So this means having many coordinating conjunctions. On the other hand, that a means without. So for example, atheist, right? Someone who believes without God. So when we see a before syndeton, we can guess that that's going to mean without coordinating conjunctions. So that, again, would be eliminating all of them. And it's usually in a way that sounds like it could be incorrect, but it's actually fine. So for example, if you say he eats, breathes, sleeps football, it sounds a little weird because typically you'd have and here, but we got rid of it using asyndeton, and this helps speed up the rhythm of a sentence or phrase. In this case, it also has a bigger impact where, because we don't even have time for the word and, it really emphasizes how pivotal of a role football is in this example sentence. Our last repetition, one that we're talking about today, is alliteration, which is repetition of the same or similar consonant sounds in words that are close together. A couple things to point out. Consonant, as a reminder, is any letter that is not a vowel, A, E, I, O, U, sometimes Y. And it's important to note that we're saying consonant sounds. It's not necessarily the same letter, but it's the same sound. So for example, K and C will sometimes have the same sound, and that can be alliteration even though they won't look the same. So an example from a famous poem called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free, we were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. So we've got multiple examples here of alliteration. We've got breeze blew, foam flew. You could even possibly count fair in there, even though it's not directly next to those words. It's somewhat close. It'd be a stretch, but some AP exam questions would count that. Furrow followed free, and silent sea. And this creates a musical effect or a flow for literature. We also see alliteration used a lot in marketing, and that's usually just to make the name sound catchier. So when you think of major chains like Bed Bath & Beyond or Krispy Kreme, there's usually some sort of alliteration there because it sticks in your head a little bit easier. Next one might also be familiar, onomatopoeia. That's where the word sounds like what they're trying to describe. So for example, pop and zap are both words where when you say the word out loud, it sounds like the sound that they are trying to describe. And this just helps add to the auditory imagery. It just is very clear what you're describing and how it should sound. Our next two are also going to be doubled up because they are somewhat related, and those are metonymy and synecdoche. Metonymy is where you use a figure of speech it is a figure of speech where you refer to a person, place, or thing with something else closely associated with it. So you're having something associated with that person, place, or thing stand in for the description of them. So for example, when we say the White House announced the new bill, we don't literally mean that the White House announced it. We are talking most likely about the president. And this would be an example of metonymy because instead of saying the president, we're using something closely associated to it. When we think of the White House, we think of the president. Another example, if you say they requested support from the crown, again, they're not actually going up and like talking to a crown, they're talking to the king or queen in this case, and you would use the crown as an example of metonymy to kind of step in and have that association. A possible effect of metonymy is it can be used to make writing more concise without needing to repeat who you're talking about every time. You can key into that person with shorter phrases like White House or crown. It also helps add to the imagery of the sentence. Synecdoche is somewhat related, where you're still using this literary device to replace what you're talking about, but rather than metonymy, where you're just using something closely associated with that object, in synecdoche you're using a part to represent the whole. So for example, if you say he got a new set of wheels, maybe he really did literally just get a pair of wheels, but you're probably referring to a car. So this would be an example of synecdoche where you're using just a part of the whole. So in this case, you're using just the wheels to refer to the whole car. This has a similar effect as metonymy, just making writing more concise and adding to the imagery. And our last one for today is hyperbole. This is just where you use exaggeration or overstatement. For example, your suitcase weighs a ton, or it took me forever. We use hyperbole a lot in everyday speech, so we might be kind of numb to some of these examples, but just keep an eye out for those in our reading. And this just intensifies the subject of work, makes it a little bit more dramatic. And that's our last one, so just make sure your notes are up to date so we can start practicing together.